Hi, and welcome to our discussion of thunderstorms. We're working through hazards right now.
The thunderstorm hazard that we're discussing in this video is convective wind shear. In another video on my YouTube channel, we already discussed weather producers. In this video, we're going to talk about strategies for avoidance of wind shear and also how inadvertent encounters with wind shear can be avoided and what they look like.
So number one, the wind shear strategy. Of course, we saw that there have been many aircraft accidents that resulted from convective wind shear. Some wind shears were very strong, others were very weak. But overall, wind shear should be avoided because aircraft can't fly successfully through all different types of wind shear. So if there are any signs of wind shear, it should be avoided. However, if you do inadvertently encounter wind shear, you should know how to recover. So back in the 1980s, the FAA put together an advisory circular helping pilots identify wind shear. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the inadvertent wind shear encounters.
Next, we'll talk about inadvertent encounters with wind shear. We will look at 3 different scenarios where wind shear may be inadvertently encountered, and those will be right after liftoff, on the runway as the airplane is accelerating, or as an airplane is approaching to land. The first scenario that we'll discuss is if wind shear is encountered during takeoff right after the aircraft has rotated and is just starting its initial climb. In this case, the airplane is accelerating down the runway and takeoff appears to be normal until it reaches perhaps maybe the end of the runway where things start to change. As the aircraft climbs out from the runway, it starts to experience an increasing tailwind shear.
So with the increasing tailwind shear, you know that is performance decreasing. And performance decreasing means that you'll see a loss of airspeed, and the resulting loss of airspeed will produce less lift, and also the airplane will want to pitch down to regain its trimmed airspeed. And if the pilot allows the aircraft to continue to ascend, it will impact the ground and crash shortly after liftoff. So this is what the lift and the flight path look like during a normal climb right after liftoff. But if you encounter an increasing tailwind shear, your lift will be reduced dramatically because of the reduced airspeed. And the airplane will want to pitch down, and if you allow it to do that, it'll impact the ground. So the FAA recommends that you control the flight path with pitch. So pitch the aircraft up, and they recommend up to 15 degrees, and then that will give you a much lower airspeed. But they said the FAA in the Advisory Circular 00-54, the Pilot Wind Shear Guide, says that it's okay to have a reduced airspeed as long as you don't stall the aircraft. The main goal is to keep the aircraft airborne until you're out of the shear, and then let the aircraft accelerate.
The next inadvertent wind shear encounter that we'll discuss is as an airplane accelerates on the runway during its takeoff roll. As the airplane accelerates down the runway, everything seems to be normal.
So their airspeed looks normal during the acceleration until they encounter an increasing tailwind shear. And when that happens, they'll either notice a hesitation in the airspeed or the airspeed may build up more slowly. So what happens is the aircraft may never reach the rotation speed, or it may reach the rotation speed at the very end of the runway. The pilots decide to rotate then. It's too late. The aircraft will probably impact the antennas at the end of the runway or other obstacles at the end of the runway because the aircraft will not want to climb either. So there have been cases where aircraft have impacted the localizer antennas and continued to climb and could not pressurize the aircraft. So this is what lift looks like normally during a normal rotation. But with increasing tailwind shear, you have reduced lift and a reduced airspeed. So the problem is the aircraft will run off the end of the runway and never get airborne. So the key with a increasing tailwind shear on the runway is to get the aircraft airborne well before the end of the runway, which means that you need to rotate the aircraft with at least 2,000 feet remaining, if not before then, and also sometimes below rotation speed. The aircraft will get airborne at an airspeed below rotation speed, and increase your lift and get the aircraft off the ground and keep it airborne as long as possible until you're out of the shear.
Our final inadvertent wind shear encounter scenario that we will discuss is airplanes that are on final approach coming into land that will experience shear as they approach the airport. If there is a microburst on final approach as the aircraft approaches the runway, it will experience an increasing headwind shear, which means that it may experience or may show an increase in indicated airspeed. As the aircraft continues its approach, the increasing headwind shear changes to a downdraft, and the aircraft will start to descend below its flight path, and then eventually it will experience an increasing tailwind shear.
With an increasing tailwind shear, the airplane will descend below its glide path, and it has an increased loss of airspeed due to the increasing tailwind shear and also a performance loss. So if the pilots allow the aircraft to continue along this flight path, it will impact short of the runway. During normal climb, this is what the lift looks like, the lift vector. You've got good lift and your flight path is to the end of the runway. With increasing tailwind shear, the aircraft loses lift and will want to pitch down because of the decreased airspeed. It wants to regain its trimmed airspeed. And as a result, because of that, the aircraft will impact the ground if you allow it to. So in summary, these are the things that can be taken away from an inadvertent wind shear encounter. Number one, it's difficult sometimes to recognize that you're in wind shear. And you need to do things fast because the aircraft will impact the ground in a short time if corrective action is not taken. So your time is limited. Also, the crew needs to be working together. That way, the pilot flying will get cues from the pilot non-flying as far as the performance of the aircraft. So in other words, need to work as a coordinated team. And then also, this is very important that you need to control the flight path with the pitch, meaning that bring the nose up, and they say up to 15 degrees above the horizon and more, all the way up to the point of stall, which means that you don't really rely that much on airspeed when you're in shear. You're more looking at pitch and trying to keep the aircraft airborne without stalling the airplane. So those are the three different scenarios for inadvertent wind shear encounters. In the next video, we're going to talk about how to recognize wind shear, and we're going to look at the steps that you can take to avoid wind shear and then finally recover from inadvertent wind shear.